Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So I was asked to speak about trends in the economy, which we observe right now, trends in the financial system, and about some potential financial risks. So let me, okay. Don't think I know how to, okay. No, so let me speak about this. In my talk, I'll speak about the state of the economy and some of the trends in economic and financial system which we observe right now and which can have long-term effects on economy and financial system. So let me start with the obvious that over the past year and a half, the global economy has found itself in a very unusual situation. So we are in a crisis, economic crisis. We had financial crisis a year ago, but it occurred not for economic reasons, but because of epidemiological shock. And it makes it quite strong and fundamentally different from other crises which we had in the last years. You see the list of some of the crises on this slide. What's specific about crisis is that things may change very quickly and sometimes unpredictably. And of course, it requires us to adjust in our behavior and our policy, but on the other hand, we can learn lots of lessons from these economic trends, which we during the crisis. So what do we know? Well, again, last year we first observed significant financial crisis. Then most of the economies globally were closed. So we observed collapse of the global economy, of global production. Then economies started to recover. And now we are at this stage when the world economy is facing uneven recovery. There are countries which have high rates of vaccinations, which may have a high level of government supports, which are largely open, and these countries recovers faster. Other countries may still be closed because of high rates of infections, or which recover much slowly because of lack of support. So the recovery is very uneven, and the epidemiological situation differs significantly from country to country. And some of the economic trends which we observe right now are the results of this uneven recovery. For example, an important factor is that under conditions of an uneven recovery, normal global supply chains and economic interactions continue to erode. And this leads to change in the kind of nature of pandemic impact on the economy in comparison to the last year. Last year, economic downturn was accompanied by low inflation. And the main cause for that was limited demand. This year, as I said, growth is accelerating in many countries, and balance of risks has shifted toward inflationary risks. We see in many countries, not everywhere, but inflation going to historically high for the last, say, 20 years, for example. And discrepancy in supply and demand play a key role. Demand recovers often quite sharply once the pandemic situation improved and lockdowns were lifted. Massive fiscal stimulus in some countries provided extra boost to demand. But as opposed to demand, supply recovers less rapidly bearing long-lasting scars from the COVID-19 in the form of elevated uncertainty, break of supply chain, increased costs, and remaining constraints related to COVID-19. And well, I represent the central bank. The central bank is the policy institution which is responsible for financial stability and for price stability, meaning for low inflation. And for us, of course, this is a tricky situation because we need to understand how to react to that. And most of the central bank, including ours, attribute a large part of the increase in inflation, which we observe right now, to temporary factors, meaning that we consider the supply chain breakdown as temporary. So we think that if they go away, inflation will go down. But nonetheless, even this kind of analysis leads to different reaction on behalf of different central banks. For instance, central banks in advanced economy can, even in this situation, continue accommodative monetary policy. They believe that inflation was very low for a number of years, so this temporary spike on inflation will not have significant persistent effects because inflation expectations are low. In many emerging markets, where inflation expectations have been not so stable and where they have already risen significantly, central bank had to increase policy rates to prevent second round effect. And Russia belongs to this part of central banks. However, for us, of course, the situation is slightly different because our economy is already recovered quite significantly from the last year fall. So we do not need that much of an easy monetary policy to support the economy. What are the risks in this situation, right? I was asked questions, what can lead to risk, to new financial turbulences? And one of the risks is that inflation may turn out persistently higher in advanced economies. And if it will happen, then since the central banks, the Fed, for instance, in this particular case, they anyway have mandate for price stability, they will have to eventually tighten monetary policy, and they will have to do it faster, quicker, and sharper than otherwise. And it may lead to significant volatility on the domestic market, economic decline, and significant volatility on global markets. And it will negatively affect emerging markets. So this is one of the risks which we believe we can face in the next months or maybe a couple of years. Another risk is sort of the opposite, is that pandemic will last longer than we expected. And we will see more and more new waves of the pandemic. We already see this, right? We see new strains of the virus. So it may lead to, may require changes in the strategy of medical approach to the situation, and not just one round of vaccinations, but many rounds of vaccinations. Change in treatment, spreading of the best ways of treatment around the countries in order to decrease the effect of this continuous pandemic risks on the economy and on the health of the population. In these scenarios, inflation risks may increase or decrease depending on the situation with the pandemic. But we should also understand that economic and social shocks, particularly in some of the countries and some of the emerging markets countries, can be tougher because monetary and fiscal space is even more limited than it was before. Last year, governments and central banks in many countries eased policy in order to support the economy and financial markets. Now the space for that decrease. Central bank cannot provide that much support because of high inflation, and governments because of high debt. So it is another risks which we need to manage, and we will need to find the way out of the situation if we will face this risk. Well, so this is about kind of current situation, and once again, something is with the presentation. Something is with my slides. I don't know why. What's going on?
А если мышкой понажимать?
А куда мышкой понажимать?
Да просто на слайд. Обычно у меня тоже была такая проблема.
Вот я нажимаю мышкой на слайд.
Угу.
Так, что-то вообще случилось странное со слайдом. Так, давайте я остановлю, может быть, запущу его снова. Как-то совсем все трагично. Сейчас, one second, I'll call for the technical support, okay? And we will continue the lecture without the slides for me. So let me try to continue without slides. I understand that it may be somewhat more complicated for you, but given the technical problems, I think it's easier. So what is next? I would like to talk to you not only about the current situation, but maybe about key structural changes which we may observe as a result of the pandemic, right, which will affect global economy and economies of different countries during this late pandemic and post-pandemic world, and will lead to, again, changes in the structure of the economies, affect all kind of policies, and maybe affect you when you will go in the labor market. And I think that there are 5 major trends like this. And first of them is, of course, COVID-19 has catalyzed digitalization, and it had impact and will have bigger impact on different markets. It will change the way we travel. It will change the way we buy goods and services. It will even change the way we work. Well, of course, it started before, right? Before the pandemic, already digitalization was ongoing, but definitely when everyone got locked in their homes, businesses had to reorient by shifting process to online as much as possible. So as a result, what we see that now we have more online conferences. Right, I speak to you online, not offline, and of course, when lockdowns and other regulations due to the pandemic will change, we will definitely travel more for business. But nonetheless, we got so used to these electronic ways of communication that I think that it will stay with us, and we will see maybe more hybrid events rather than we'll go back to where we were before with very small number of digital events. But that's not only it. Digitalization of shopping has increased, and online shopping entrenched even further in comparison to where we were before with it. Finally, remote work has become a norm in many spheres, and we now hear that in the countries where workforce was only under the lockdown for quite a while, people do not want to go back to work, or they do not go back to work 5 days a week. They want to work like 3 days on the workplace from home and so on. So this is a persistent trend which will change the way economy is organized in the future. And for governments, or for government institutions, so for public institutions like the Central Bank, this is of course a challenge, because what we need to do, we need to enable this digitalization further. We need to create public infrastructure for digitalization to continue benefiting the economy and benefiting people. And of course, the Bank of Russia pays significant attention to that as an institution which is responsible for financial market infrastructure. Let me take a 1 second break. I will try to fix the presentation.
Guys, big applause. Yeah, we see the presentation.
Okay,
it's very good.
Good. I hope that it will not break anymore. So what the Bank of Russia is doing, Bank of Russia has a number of digital projects for the industry, which we think will enable more digital provision of digital services and improve competition on the financial markets. And among such projects is faster payment system. It's quite common in Russia when you can pay person to person using mobile telephone. And faster payment system allows doing this not only within between accounts in one bank, but from one bank to another. Right, I have accounts in several banks, for example, and it takes me a few seconds to transfer money from one bank to another, and it costs zero. So this is what the faster payment system does, and it already enabled significant change in the way people pay to their relative, how we would transfer money to our relative, friends, often how we pay to providers of goods and services. The next project is what we call Digital ID Profile. This is a platform which allows, on the one hand, financial institutions, for example, banks, have access to government data, which are needed, for instance, to assess credit risks of specific customers. But also we use this platform as a platform where customers allow banks to access information. For instance, if a bank, in order to issue credit to a customer, would like to access information from the credit bureau, it can use this platform to get the agreement from this particular person to access this information, and so on. And we think that this digital profile we developed together with the government would be more elaborated and will allow citizens to control how the information is used by different financial institutions. I'll skip marketplace for now. I'll go to digital biometrical identification. This is also a joint project with the government. Of course, if everyone has digital ID and if it is the same ID, then many services can be done digitally, provided digitally by the financial system, but not only by the financial system, but by all other types of digital service providers. So this is also a very important project. The next project is the so-called marketplace. This is the project which we built in order actually to improve competition in the financial system, but also to provide individuals with more flexibility when they can compare and use services of different financial institutions. For instance, they can put their money on deposits in different banks through this kind of system, get insurance, eventually get mortgage loans, and so on, digitally through the system in different financial institutions. And one more project which I would like to talk about is central bank digital currency, and in our case, this is digital ruble. Well, you know, during the pandemic, the topic of central bank digital currencies, digital euro, digital pound, well, digital yuan, or digital RMB, digital dollar at the end of the day. It became very popular. Many central banks started to work on this project, and the Bank of Russia is in this group of central bank which works on this project. Last year, we first published consultation reports, so we had consultations with the general public, businesses, financial institutions. As a result of those consultations, we published concept note. This year, we're gonna do prototype. And we think that sooner or later, digital currencies provided by central bank will be our future. And there are many benefits from these projects. They would allow more, they would enable more services to the customers, easier transfers between financial institutions, programmable money. You know, you would be able to use smart contracts on this type of money, and so on. There may be some costs which should be mitigated, but overall, we believe that it will improve the efficiency of payment space and eventually improve the economic efficiency. So this is why we consider this project very important, and this is why we're working on this project. So this was the first large trend. Oh, I learned how to do it. I think the second sort of significant structural change which I would like to mention is the change in the way how business is organized. Of course, in the last 20, 30 years before the pandemic, businesses tried to improve efficiency of their production chains. So what we did, they did lots of offshoring, they used just-in-time approach, and so on. So we ended up with complicated supply chains, often production concentrated in one company or one geographical area, and so on. And pandemic showed that this way of business organization is very risky. So if there is a shock like a pandemic, but it can be anything else, or we may start getting shortages of semiconductors, for example, and of other supplies which are needed for production of final goods. So now I already saw it in Financial Times, for example. Goes a rethinking about how business can be organized, right? So business should be prepared for different risks, and supply chain should be resistant in the case of different risk, right? This is a move from just in time to just in case. What we observe for the moment, and this is one of the reasons why prices are going up, is that companies are trying to increase their inventory significantly above the average level they had before the pandemic, because they understand that if pandemic will continue, they will face a risk that they will run out of inventories. But I think eventually, in the future, we will see the change in business models. So companies will probably have more inventories, and they may have more diversified and more simple production chain in order to improve resistance of their businesses to shocks, such as pandemic, for example. Okay, the next change is change in financial regulation. Actually, financial regulators, they try to learn after every financial crisis. And already after the previous great global financial crisis, there was a significant change in financial sector regulations. It concerned banks. Banks were the weakest spot of the financial system 13 years ago, and regulation of banks tightened significantly during the last 13 years. So what happened last year? Last year, banks proved to be quite resistant. They were able to work properly during the pandemic. There were no significant failures of banks. Banks continue servicing the economy, providing financial services. Nonetheless, we had financial crisis. Why? Because particularly during the last 13 years, the share of non-banking financial institutions increased dramatically. It now accounts for about 50% of the total financial assets globally. And this part of the financial system turned out to be very vulnerable, not resistant to crisis events. So what I think will be happening in the next years, two things. First, regulation of the non-bank financial institution will continue to strengthen in order to make them themselves more resilient to financial shocks, for instance, liquidity shocks. But also, some of them may be kind of more integrated in the financial system, which is served by the central bank. Central banks may think about some sort of lender of last resort instruments for non-bank financial institutions, market financial institutions, in order to make this sector of the financial markets more resilient to different shocks. Okay, the fourth trend is growth of debt. Both private, particularly corporate, and public. And Well, why it happened, we all know. Last year, governments had to provide significant support to the economies. This is why the debt burden has increased. And the same is true about many companies. Companies had to increase their debt burden in order to survive the crisis. So it helped countries and companies to survive the crisis, but it also increased their vulnerabilities for the future, because the higher debt, the more vulnerable is state or company, and the more limited it is in order to develop policy which will help them to survive next shock. So it is one more consequence of the crisis. So on the previous slide, you saw the debt level for governments. On this slide, you also see overall debt level for non-financial companies, and you see it increased significantly last year, particularly in some of the countries. What's interesting is that last year, although debt level has increased, bankruptcy rate has decreased. It was partially artificial, but partially it may mean that in the future, we will have to deal with the phenomena called zombie companies, right? Companies whose debt level is too high, so they cannot work normally. So they serve more as a drag on economic growth rather than source of economic growth. So it's one of, but on the other hand, fast resolution of all those companies can be not in the interests of society or financial institutions for various reasons. So it's one of the challenges also for the future existence of this kind of companies. And well, one more vulnerability which I would like to mention is well, very high level of stock market valuations, or maybe even overvaluation of stock markets, and high volatility of valuations, particularly of some companies. And for this, also I think there are two reasons. First of all, is easy monetary policy. It was easy already for the last 10 plus years, and last year the trend continued. But also what we observed during the pandemic is fast growth of participation of retail investors in the financial markets. And again, what's the reason for this? Maybe several. First of all, of course, income sometimes decreased, but on the other hand, people also get additional government help, and they were forced to save. For instance, they stopped traveling, so they had extra savings because of this lack of travel. Right, so people got more resources for investment. On the other hand, deposit interest rates and interest rates on all sorts of traditional saving instruments for households declined in many countries. And of course, the third factor, digitalization, they're sitting home and they can start to experiment with different digital ways of investing their money, for example, on the stock market. And this is what we observed worldwide. It happened, well, in the US, where it is a tradition to invest on the stock market, but Europe, which before 2021, its population was net sellers of stocks. Now it's net buyers of stock. And in emerging markets, in Russia, for example, and I know that, for instance, in Brazil, we see a huge rise in the share of participation of retail customers directly on the financial markets, buying stocks and bonds on the Russian markets and on the international markets as well. And we see that the interest of this type of buy sometimes is skewed towards some well-known companies, for instance, Tesla, right, or a few days ago, Virgin Galactic. So this is one thing, but another thing is that we also observe a high volatility on some of the stock because of the specifics of the behavior of this type of investors. And let me remind you the case of Robinhood, which happened in January, right? Then retail investors had been bundling together on the online platform Reddit to put this squeeze on hedge funds. And it led to rapid, although temporary, increases stock prices of low liquid shares with a large number of short positions. So it's new, it's never happened on the stock market before, and we have to also think how to react on that. And one more trend which we observe in the financial markets right now, and which is also some form of vulnerabilities, this is overvaluation on the real estate market. Prices for housing are going up in large number of countries. For instance, in Russia, annual house price reached 10-year high level of 18% in the private market in the first quarter of 2021. Given that this fast growth in house prices may remind the events which took place before 2008-2009 crisis, right, which was largely mortgage crisis. So this unsustainable increase in house prices is also now a concern for many regulators and central banks, because eventually it can lead to financial risks. So this is about financial vulnerability, financial risks, and the need to react by the regulation. And one last thing, which I would like to discuss with you. I also see it as a trend which entrenched in the last year. This is a growing attention of the global community of governments, regulators, central banks, financial sector to climate change issues. Well, I guess all of you know that every decade since 1950 has been warmer than the one before. I actually don't know what's the weather in Kazan. In Moscow now, we have historically hottest weather for many years. I don't remember having that many hot days in a row. Well, this slide, it presents you just one of the scenario. It shows how global economy can, how sort of the Earth can warm further if the things, if the trend will continue the way we observed it before. Well, this scenario shows that in this kind of scenario, for instance, in the north parts of Russia or Canada, the level of average annual temperature by the end of the century can be almost 10 degrees Celsius higher compared to the end of the previous century. So it's a significant global warming, and also unequal one across different territories and continent. Well, this problem has been known for some time. And to tackle this problem, in 2015, the UN held a conference on climate change, where the participants concluded the famous Paris Agreement. According to the agreement, the global warming should be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the average pre-industrial global temperature. Well, it's easy to say, not so difficult to achieve, because in order to do that, countries need to go back to carbon neutral. Why global warming happens? Well, of course, there are natural trends in global century, but the theory says that it happens because while we develop, produce, and consume, we release carbon at the atmosphere, so the Earth gets warmer. Carbon neutrality is a balance between emission of carbon and absorption of it. So more and more countries, by now it's 110 countries, they committed to become carbon neutral by mid-century, but by 2050 or 2060. So that the amount of carbon emissions in these countries would be equal to the amount of carbon absorption. But this requires significant change in the way we produce, in the way we consume, and to engineer these significant changes, all kind of policies are needed, which will change the behavior of consumers, producers, and which will change the behavior of financial system. So financial system would provide more resources to transformation of the way we produce and consume. This means that governments would start introducing and increasing carbon taxes and other types of taxes or tariffs and other instruments. And there may be tighter regulation of the so-called brown assets. This is companies which emit a lot of carbon when they produce or which produce carbon intensive goods, such as coal, oil, eventually gas. Gas is now considered a good transition fuel, but it's also had its impact, although not that big, on carbon emissions. Regulators that, like central banks, also started to think that they should play their role in this process. And for the regulators, this transfer to carbon neutrality means that right now, when we assess risks, we underprice the risk of climate change, both physical risks related to different events like flooding, fires, too high temperatures, and so on, and transition risks such as effects on financial state of different companies due to these additional taxes and regulations, which stimulate a transition to low carbon economies. Regulators now started to do a lot of stress tests, and they also work with the financial sector in order to develop the proper way of assessment such climate risks and taking them into regulation of the financial sector. Okay. Again, so this sounds as a good strategy, which will lead us to carbon neutrality. Well, it also involves its risks. And actually risks are, I would say, disproportionately concentrated in the emerging economies, because it's emerging economies who produce lots of these carbon intensive products. And what we the risks are that they will have less revenues, companies will have revenues, governments will have less revenues, that companies will not be able to raise enough finance to finance their transition from today to low carbon economies and so on. And for instance, already last year, I don't know if many of you noticed, many large global funds declared that they would like to mainly invest to green assets rather than to brown assets, and that in a few years they will go out of brown assets. And this creates a problem of lack of financing for significant parts of the economy in the emerging markets, and not only financing of their current spending, but also financing of their transition to the low carbon economy. So, of course, central banks and governments in these particular countries should be prepared to this situation, but also the global institutions also discuss the situation. For instance, last week there was these G20 ministers and central bank governors in Italy, in Venice, partially on-site, partially online meeting. And there, for example, such global financial institutions as the IMF and the World Bank, they discussed this issue. They discussed that they themselves need to change their policies to assist emerging markets to and to help them to transit to and to finance green transition, and that that other development banks have to change their strategy, and that them and the governments and central banks have to change incentives of the private financial institutions also to stimulate them to finance green transition in emerging market countries. The Bank of Russia, because of that, has and Russian government, we have our own program of developing green bonds market and transitory bonds market, which would provide industry with the instruments to raise capital for the green transitions. And inside the Bank of Russia, as other regulators, we also work on methodology, which would allow to reflect climate change risks in regulation and supervision of the financial sector, and we work with the financial institutions on the methodology of assessing climate risk when they assess other risks of their clients. So overall, this is a big also trend which we will face in the post-pandemic world, which requires lots of attention of central bank governments in order to develop proper policy which would decrease risks and increase opportunities which this fighting climate change agenda creates. So that's all which I would like to talk to you about. What are the economies now, and what are the trends which I think we will see in the post-pandemic world. And as a way of the conclusion, well, I would like to say the following. Well, what can we learn from COVID-19 crisis and its effect on the economy and its effect on governments, on companies, etc.? I think it showed, and the trends which we see in the global economy, global financial markets also show that flexibility and adaptability is an important feature which sort of businesses, economies, governments, central banks, and the important people should have. And I think that for you, it's also important to know, right, that in this world, being flexible and being able to adopt to different situation is an important skill which we need to develop to face the challenges and to get all the benefits which different situation can create. So let me stop here, and I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bulat, and I'm from the Kazan Federal University. So my question is, first of all, I want to thank you for this information lecture, and it was brilliant. Thank you. And my question is about the digitalization, about what you say. As you know, now we have a problem of the which name Moscow and other regions. And in Moscow and St. Petersburg and some experiential regions like Tatarstan too, there is a digitalization process of economy was going before the pandemic. And after pandemic, during the pandemic, there are a lot of challenges from the global trends to Russian economy to grow our digitalization. And can you say, have we a problem to doubling the problem of digitalization when we will super grow digital economy in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and Tatarstan, and regions of some of them, and a very, very small growth of the digitalization in other regions? And if we have this problem, have a central bank resources to not allow to doubling this gap? Thank you.
Okay, interesting question. I think that it's a question of access to digital services. And basically, in order to have access to digital services, you need to have access to internet, right? And I should say that in Russia, as far as now I know, it's not that bad. In many areas we have access to internet, of course, not as equal as in some places. So what the central bank does, the central bank is working specifically on improving access to financial services in some remote areas. For example, we have a special project on Far East. But on the other hand, we actually think that it's easier to develop digital services on Far East rather than provide traditional services there, because if you have a not so densely population, you will need to spend a lot on tradition if you would like to provide people the same access to services in sort of traditional way as you do here in Moscow or in Kazan. So we actually think that digital services is a solution to the problem rather than a source of problem. Of course, it requires building digital infrastructure, but it's easier to build than, again, physical infrastructure for physical provision of many services. I would say that a bigger problem is probably the skills of people. And it sometimes does not depend on where people are located, but it can be a generational problem, right? Elder people, they're less digital than very young people. And this means that, again, from the point of view of the Bank of Russia, we cannot, although we work on developing digital services and increasing the percentage of digital services which people may use, we are also against this situation when old-style provision of services will stop being available, because we think that it will reduce financial inclusion for some types of people who are less digitally educated, and it will decrease welfare of the population. And the last stream is, of course, increase in financial literacy and increase in digital financial literacy. And here the problem is not just to teach people how to use digital services, but also how to not become victims of all kinds of digital crimes. Because, well, I'm not sure, but don't know how it's the situation in other countries. In all the Russians in your audience, of course, know very well that there are lots of digital crimes, and it's not even cyber attacks. Cyber attacks are actually even less of a problem than other types of crimes, for instance, all kind of phone calls or messaging to people which try to stimulate them and doing something which will eventually lead them to the loss of money for these people. This become very common in Russia, and during the pandemic it was a significant problem, and we're trying to educate people not to become victim of this kind of crime. So I guess if there are more questions.
Hello, thanks a lot for your speech. And my name is Maxim. I'm from Tomsk State University. And my question is about stock markets. In your opinion, could the current interest of people in the stock market and the emergence of easy tools to access the stock market for non-professional players like Sberbank investor, VTB investor, Tinkoff, and so on, lead to its oversaturation and the emergence of a new crash of 1929, or it will be more worse? Thanks.
First, I think that on the one hand, diversification of saving is a good thing, right? And particularly if you would like to invest for a longer period of time, if you are young, investing in shares is probably a better way than having deposits and things like this. So this is a natural process. However, what we are afraid of is that not all people which started to actively participate on the stock market this year really quite understand well enough what they are doing. Right? We are afraid, and we are also afraid that it may lead to some higher volatilities, and so people may, for instance, think that if they had very large return on the investment last year. It will continue this year with the same speed. It may not be true, and we should be prepared to this risk. They may not diversify the investments well enough, and things like this. And we think that if they have one idea which will not realize, that they can withdraw their money too quickly from the stock market, so there will be too much volatility. So what we think we should do in this situation is, first of all, we work on increasing investors' financial literacy, right? Not just general financial literacy, but investors' financial literacy, and probably try to understand why people prefer to invest themselves rather than using services of investing companies and so on, and investment funds and so on, and maybe also try to develop this sector of collective investments, which will help to balance risks for people. And one thing which we have already implemented is, as you know, or partially implemented, there is a new law on qualified and unqualified investors, and investors will have to take exams in order to demonstrate that they are qualified and probably have sufficient amount of resources. And many complicated projects, financial companies will not be able to sell to unqualified investors, but also financial companies will have to, if they sell some complicated products to their customers, they have to describe their risks in a special, simple way, and make sure that people understand what they are buying. So this is another regulations which come into place right now, and which we think will help to reduce the risks of this active interest in retail investors in investing in the stock market directly or other financial instruments which are provided to them by financial institutions. More questions?
Hello, my name is Nim and I'm from Sri Lanka. I want to ask about some huge, the big scale companies trying to acquire the mid-level companies and the small level businesses, especially during this COVID pandemic. A lot of businesses went bankrupt, so these huge companies, they acquired those. And especially in my country, we have such kind of example. So they acquired all the competitors. So they play sort of a monopoly in this business. So how this affect to the economy of such of a country, and what will be the negative and positive impacts to a country's economy in these situations?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for this question. Well, you know, without knowing specific, it's difficult to say. On the one hand, consolidation may have positive effect on development because it's allowed to use what economists call increasing economy to scale, right? On network effects, for example. For example, in payment systems, you really have this network effect. If I can use this payment system, everybody else would like to use, it would be better if all of my friends are in the same network system, in the same payment system, so we would be able to pay to each other if it's needed, or the same with telephones, right? So, it's better if you can call everyone within this system. But on the other hand, I agree that it comes with monopolistic effects, which can be, but not only for development, but for consumer rights protection, for business rights protection, and things like this. And it is a really big challenge right now for everybody, because many digital services, they have huge network effect. And this is why, if you think about digital companies, of course, there are some small ones, but many of them are very large and big monopoly. And they acquire other businesses, so they use their monopoly power, and they know lots of data about people, which allows them to go into other sectors and explore the knowledge about customers. On the one hand, it may be good for the customers because we can get goods and services cheaper, but on the other hand, it also means that they can prevent competition in a growing number of sectors. And this is a big problem for regulators everywhere. For instance, in Russia, the Russian Central Bank, we are very much concerned that some of our large banks, they would like to become what they call ecosystems, right, and provide non-banking services to their customers. And we think that in addition to this kind of effects, which we've just discussed, effects on competition, it may also create additional risks to the lenders and creditors. So we recently issued 2 consultation reforms on the regulating ecosystems as sort of for antitrust reasons, for consumer protection reasons, for labor protection reasons, but also we issued an additional consultation report on the regulations of financial institutions which have such ecosystems or non-typical financial assets in order to decrease risks for usual financial sector clients. So I guess I'll stop here with answering this question.
Hello, my name is Rad from Jordan. Thank you for interesting presentation. Like my question is like, you mentioned that the COVID pandemic crisis a new world like experience for all of us. And you also mentioned like the marketplace and digitalization. My question is like, what do you like, and what is like your opinion about the people like after the pandemic? Like they will like continue working like remotely, or will they like go back to their normal lives? And what is like the disadvantage and advantage from this? Thank you.
Okay, I think that we will see more hybrid types of working. Because this is what I tried to say. Well, I think it can be beneficial both for companies and for people. Right, for companies, it may allow to save on some office space, which is quite expensive. People, I think, also adjusted to working from home, and they believe that there are some benefits to this, less commute. You can probably more efficiently distribute your time between work and other house responsibilities and so on. On the other hand, I don't think we will go completely to remote work because it also has its negative side, particularly if you try to do it long enough. And I would say that the biggest problem is integration of new members to the team. Right? If it is a company or some division within company which work with each other for long and they know each other very well, and they can go for remote working for some time, and they will be probably as efficient as they were before if they have enough digital tools. But if it is someone new who need to sort of integrate into the team, who need to know everybody, who need to understand his responsibility, who may need some only place training and advice from his colleagues and so on. It's much more complicated. So I think that this will not happen completely, or either new tasks, either significant changes are required. It's often easier to discuss them in person than via sort of digital remote tools. So I think that we will be more hybrid. We will work more remotely, but we will not stay with 100% remote work.
Hello, my name is Irina, I'm from Moscow, and firstly, thank you for your presentation. And now my question is, why was it decided to continue preferential mortgage program till the July next year, if now we see outrageous prices of flats? Thank you.
Okay, well, you know, the Central Bank of Russia was arguing that we need to end this program, but finally we agreed with the government that we do not need sudden stop either, right? So we need sort of a more smooth exit from this program, and this is why it was continued, but conditions were tightened. The program will look less lucrative than the previous one. So next question.
Good evening. My name is Sofia, and first of all, I want to say thank you for your lecture, and my question is the next. What do you think about such organization like Finika from Kazan, with its head Kirill Doronin? It's such organization, then people can finance their money for 2 or 3 times more. And what do you think? There is an end to this in the form of the law, or this really legal organization? Thank you.
Well, as far as I understand, you're speaking about one of the pyramids, illegal pyramids. I think that it is illegal. And it should stop working. You know, when I was your age, we had MMM, which was also financial pyramids. So I have a very strong view on these kind of companies.
Yes, we have a question here.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is Monitor, I'm from Kyrgyzstan, and I have this question about digital currency that you mentioned in your presentation. So how eager is Russia in implementing such currency, and what are the steps? What steps should be done to implement it in the Russian economy or global economy, let's say, as well? Thank you.
Usually what countries do, they of course consult with the public on what it can be. But in addition to that, you know, this currency should be based on new technologies. right? So we need to experiment a lot in order to see that they are reliable enough and that they produce reliably the types of services which we would like them to have. So Russia is at the stage where this year we will build a prototype and start testing. And I think that after that, if the tests will be successful, we will think about sort of building a system. But we start with prototype and tests, like other countries. Right, many other countries. Well, China is, of course, ahead of others. It's actively does testing and sometimes quite a large-scale testing. But other countries also, they do prototypes, they do proof of contests, they do experiments with cross-border payments with this kind of system. So there are a lot of experiments globally right now of digital currencies of central banks.
Thank you. And the last question.
Then I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind. So, in case if Russia, let's say, successfully implements a digital currency, what advantages or what boost will it give to the economy? Thank you.
Okay. Faster payments, more efficient payments, maybe new types of payments. We spoke about remote areas, etc. Faster payments to remote areas. Then we believe that it will be programmable money, so both customers and maybe financial institutions, which might also use it as a sort of transmission channel, will be able to provide customers with different smart contract, right? Paying of money under the conditions, under some conditions automatically. So on. It will allow people and companies basically also better manage their liquidity. I think that these are the main benefits, and government will be able probably to use the system to for some transfers. Then of course it will be, we think that we will be able to provide a way of using some of this money offline, so it will be offline electronic payments and things like this, but that's later on. And through more efficient payments, right, more efficient economy.
Ksenia Valentinovna, thank you very much for this interesting lecture. We're really glad to see you and to hear this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and well, good luck to everyone.